Please unmute.
Hello everyone, welcome. I have the great honor to introduce the legend we all look forward to, Professor SAIGAL. She is the one responsible for the very famous follow-up that we all know of. Dr. SAIGAL and her colleagues have followed up one of the population-based cohorts of extremely low birth rate infants longitudinally from infancy into adulthood, and she has published extensively on the same. She was the principal investigator and the co-investigator for the various follow-up studies on mental health and cardiovascular and metabolic sequelae of the same cohort in their 30s. Just imagine. These studies have generated several important publications on one of the oldest in age cohort of extremely premature infants from all around the world. She is also the co-founder with Professor Iro Kajandi of the Adults Born Preterm International Collaboration, APIC. We have all heard of this, a network that facilitates collaboration and sharing of data with investigators interested in the long-term health and disease of this vulnerable condition, population. Dr. SAIGAL is a leader. She has held many leadership positions in the Canadian Pediatric Society. She is a recipient of many awards. I can't read the whole list. I have shortlisted some of them because it's injustice not to read them, even though I can't complete the whole list. The Senior Scientist Career Award from the Canadian Institute of Health Research 2000 to 2005, Canadian Pediatric Society's prestigious Distinguished Neonatologist Award, the Society's highest award for neonatology in 2005, the Landmark Award from the section of Perinatal Pediatrics of American Academy of Pediatrics 2009, the Douglas K. Richardson Award from the American Society of Pediatric Research 2011 for a lifetime achievement as a clinical investigator who has made substantial contributions to the perinatal and pediatric healthcare research. In 2018, Dr. SAIGAL was awarded the Virginia Apgar Award for the distinguished contribution to perinatal medicine and also recognized by alma mater with the McMaster Faculty of Health Sciences Community Distinction Award. Well, friends, I can go on and on. I would just end with another book we have all heard of. By now know who is the author of this very authoritarian book for lay audience, Preemie Voices, that incorporates letters written by the former preemies now in their 30s and the research findings on them. It's actually accompanied by a very interesting 25-minute video documentary, which the link I will share in the group as the talk goes on. So needless to say, Professor SAIGAL is one of the great legends we are fortunate to have in this platform. This is 34th webinar in our series. She is recognized internationally for her studies that focus on the quality of life and consequence of having born extremely prematurely. And in this International World Breastfeeding Week, the legend we have chosen is none other than Professor SAROJ SAIGAL. Over to you, Professor SAIGAL.
Good evening to you all. I gave Manoj a shorter CV so that he wouldn't go on. And really, it's a great pleasure, great honor. And I thank you very much, Manoj, for inviting me. And I wish I was there personally because Kerala is such a beautiful place. But this is the best we can do. So at this point, shall I share the screen then?
Please, ma'am. Please go ahead.
Okay, so I will be talking about the lifetime perspectives of former very premature and extremely premature infants from infancy to adulthood. And I have nothing to disclose. And so the objectives are to present the outcome longitudinally, as Manoj emphasized, from infancy to adulthood in the same cohort, and to elaborate on a broad range of outcomes at adulthood from the McMaster studies, but also I want to add from the world literature. And I will review why some children do well and some not. And there's continuity and change over time. And there's role of biological and environmental factors in the recovery. And obviously, these are older children, so the implications for current survivors is important. So there's a huge problem with global burden of prematurity. And every year, about 15 million premature babies are born per year. And these comprise 11% of all births. And 1 million children die due to prematurity. And the birth rate of preterm births obviously ranges from 5% to 18 in Europe to 18% or even more in Africa and Asia. And the countries with the greatest number of premature births are India and China. Now, you will note that India has 3.5 million premature births per year, and China has 1.17 million people, premature children per year. And the population of China is slightly higher than in India. So in India, we are producing more preterm births. And so we need to really step up and see what we can do to prevent so many preterm births. And of course, the rates of extremely preterm and very preterm are low, but the mortality and is high and the survival rate is the lowest. Now, in this graph, I want to show you the gestational age-specific survival for extremely preterm infants. So if you look at 22 to 23 weeks, there's a huge variation. Look, incredible variation in the proportion of infants who survive. And the reason for that is the aggressiveness of intervention. Japan is the most aggressive, and they have always had the highest rates. Taiwan follows, and also the Express study in green from Sweden. And the rates of survival in France are the lowest because they're very stringent in who they save, and they don't save the extremely preterm infants. So as you see, the gap, the range gets narrower as the gestational age advances, so that at 28 weeks, the majority of people save infants and the survival is very similar. And so the survival starts to improve at 26 weeks and the disparity is less at that time. Now I'm going to talk about the methodology of follow-up studies because there are different ways of reporting it. Cohort studies are the most common way, and the advantages are that you get detailed assessments on whatever aspect the investigator is interested in. And you can look at emotional, behavioral, psychiatric issues, and you can measure health appropriately. The disadvantages are it's very time consuming. We lose so many children as they age advances. It's very expensive and it's difficult to get funding for long-term outcomes. And therefore, most studies, we are restricted to the extremely preterm and very preterm infants. But because, as I mentioned, the survival rate is so low in these, the birth rate is so low in these infants, then it takes a long time to accumulate an adequate sample, and the sample sizes tend to be much smaller. And population-based studies reduce the selection bias. And we were one of the first to do the population-based studies at McMaster, and therefore our children are the oldest in the world because they were recruited the earliest. Then the Epicure from the UK, EpiPage from France, Victorian from Australia, New Zealand, and Europe. There are now several centers that have studies at adulthood, and they're all reaching 20 to 30 years of age. Now, this is very interesting. The Scandinavian studies, what they do is every single birth, they record everything from birth to death. Their illnesses, their graduation rates, their employments, their marriage, divorces, mm, illnesses, psychiatric problems, everything is recorded from birth to death. So it's all in the computer. So they have very large databases. There's minimal losses to follow up because they're all in the computer. And it's non laborious, cost effective. And what you can also do is not restrict to small age range, gestational age. You can have a wide age range. You can do 36 weekers, which we don't do because it's so difficult to get money. But the disadvantages are that, it's obviously data entered by people, and you don't know the severity of disabilities, like cerebral palsy can be ambulatory or in a wheelchair. The functional aspects, emotional aspects are not there. And data on less than 26 weeks is sparse because in Europe, they have only recently started to resuscitate infants who are very premature. But we cannot do this in North America because the stringent confidentiality regulations. So now you can say, how long do we follow premature infants? The short-term follow-up initially used to be less than 3 years, but now we go preschool, school age. The longer terms are adolescence and adulthood. And obviously, everyone cannot do these studies because it needs a lot of financing. And as I said, it's difficult to get financing. So now that everybody's done to adulthood, should we go to middle age or old age? Of course, we'll have to get younger investigators because people like me will be dead when these people reach middle age and old age. So do our responsibilities end? Where do they end? Do we do cradle to death? And I believe so. People have to continue to do this. So we've studied infants from toddler, school age, teenage, young adult, and adulthood, and we published several longitudinal studies. So at 3 years, and I'm giving you a brief overview because I want to focus more on adult outcomes. So the early years, the development of premature infants is usually delayed, even if you correct for prematurity. And 6 to 10% or higher, depending on the country, are diagnosed with neurological problems, cerebral palsy being the most common. There's delay in language skills are really delayed in premature infants, but they do improve with remedial assistance. And some children present with behavioral problems. Now, most children should catch up in the future, and particularly between 3 and 5, we've noticed incredible catch up. If we look at age 8 years, premature children have lower IQs compared to full term, and it's really important to get a comparison group. If you don't have a comparison group, you don't know how relative the rates of low IQ are. And 1/4 to 1/3 present with learning problems, and obviously there's a gradient, it's higher in the extremely preterm infants. Now, every single study has shown that premature children have math difficulties and in executive functioning. And so a significant proportion require remedial assistance at school. And that is not too forthcoming. We have difficulty with that, and parents get very frustrated. And other issues that present are behavioral problems and inattention and hyperactivity, particularly among boys. And this has been replicated in many other studies all over the world. If we look at age 15 and adolescence, so what happens? The lower IQ and learning problems continue, and they have very high rates of learning disabilities. And as math also continues. And it's present even with infants without neurological impairments. Now, I want to tell you all the studies that we do, and I put my McMaster logo there, we include every single child in our reports, including those with impairments. And later you can do sensitivity analysis and remove them. But I think it's important for every child to be counted. So the prevalence of neurological impairments and the prevalence of learning and educational difficulties are present even in those without neurological impairments. And if you do economic analyses, in neonatal intensive care is known to be very expensive, but the next expensive part is the costs associated with supporting the education of premature infants. So if we move to 24 years of age, now earlier we were doing all these laboratory tests of IQs and speech and language and motor, etc. So at adulthood, I decided to do something different. What I wanted to see and what parents want to know is, will my child be independent, or will I be looking after my child for the rest of their life? So, of course, I don't know anything about adulthood. And so I reviewed a lot of sociological literature. And it seems as if a successful transition to adulthood includes these criteria: completing education, working full time, and gaining financial independence, living independently from the parental home, which in North America is very important, but in India, we all stay in the parents' home. So getting married and having a child. And this Time magazine reported that adulthood is delayed all over the world. Now, I always say at your age, when I was 22, I had done my medical education, and here it's now 26 to 27 years of age. And getting married is also getting delayed. So it's a worldwide phenomenon that what happens in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it happens much later now. But it happens. And currently in North America, they consider these three very important, which is, I'm thankful. Getting married and having a child may not be on their agenda on everyone. So the summary I'll tell you: at young adulthood between 20 to 24 years of age. So look, we had a sample of 166. This was the largest sample in the world, but it's a very small sample. So we were able to follow 90% of these children at 24 years of age and 92% of the controls, which is really amazing. We didn't expect that. So what we found, after all I've told you about all their problems, their cerebral palsy, their learning difficulties, behavioral problems, we expected that there would be a big difference between the premature and the comparison group of controls which were matched earlier. But what to our surprise, we found that they were functioning at the same level as the normal birth weight participants in all these criteria, statistically. So there were no statistical differences, but they were a bit lower. And there were some qualitative differences. And there was evidence of emerging psychopathology, particularly in females. So the problem is, when you look, you find things. So if you look at more detailed assessments, you will find things. Otherwise, you can sit and say, oh, they're doing very well. But it's also important to see how they continue at adulthood and beyond. So again, we were very fortunate to get funding, and we looked at them in their 30s. And again, let me tell you about the evolution of assessment measures. In childhood, we were focusing on cognition, school achievement, and behavior. At adolescence, we were looking at broader accomplishments, self-perception, mental health, and quality of life. Now, at mature adulthood, it's amazing that at the same time that you're looking after newborns, we're talking about the aging premature infant. And so we were looking at cardiometabolic sequelae, psychiatric problems, and even reproduction. I mean, we have tiny babies, and we're talking about reproduction. So if we look at education and employment in this age group, again, to our amazement, there were no differences in the years of education between the two groups. And again, this includes all children, including those with disabilities. Employment in the last year was lower, 80 versus 91%. But the key difference was that the total personal income is nearly half of what it is for normal birth weight. 26,000 versus 46,000. And total household income 54,000 versus 78,000. And these differences remained even after exclusion of those with neurological impairments. So even if you, the neurological children with oh, I keep calling them children, adults with neurological impairments were also able to participate. So the Scandinavian studies now, which has very large numbers, have shown the same things, and I'm so glad that they can replicate that. It was preterm birth was associated with a stepwise increase in disability and decreased chances of completing university and net lower income. And the greatest impact is on the smallest infants. However, despite the higher prevalence of disabilities, they reported that a significant proportion of young adults had completed high school education and were functioning well in society. And as a group, they contributed more to income tax than they received in benefits. So Europe and North America, and not North America, Canada, and I guess even the UK and Australia, they have socialized medicine and socialized support so that those with difficulties will get benefits, but they were contributing to income tax as well. So the Bavarian study is one of the first studies, or the only study, that looked at their IQs. As I said, we did not look at IQs because we were more interested in other aspects. So every researcher can have different views, and we get an overall nice picture. So the IQ in this Bavarian cohort, and they had 217 children, there was zero point 0.9 to 1.27 lower, and executive function was also lower. And very low birth weight adults had multiple cognitive deficits, and only 27% did not have any deficits, compared to 51% of the controls. Now, here I should stop and tell you that so the controls, 50% of controls also had some deficits in some areas, and we consider controls as gold standard. And so, surprised, gee, controls should have be perfectly normal and have no deficits, but that's not the case. And this is why comparisons are very important, and contemporaneous comparison, because we want to compare with same age and same cohort. And there was a significant additive effect of social class. Social class can change the picture completely. If you have a child from a higher social class, they will do much better, and even compared to control infants, than those with lower social class. So very low birth adults, the summary is that they do not outgrow their intellectual deficits and will require assistance throughout life. Now, it's interesting that other people have looked at brain size and educational performance. And we know that the brain of premature infants is smaller, has less complexity, and there's loss of white and gray matter. But what the Victorian study, which is Australia, showed that at 18 years, the brain volume was smaller by 6% than control brains. And the smaller brain tissue was associated with poorer educational performance in all aspects, spelling, math, etc., and explained 20 to 40% of the variance. So small brain size with MRI, they associated that with poorer performance. And concerns have been expressed that if premature infants have such small brain volumes, they will have poorer memory and early dementia. So we looked at independent living, marriage, and sexuality, and you can see that half of the premature infants never married or were not cohabiting, which is fairly common in North America, compared to 34%. Again, 34% or 35% of normal birth weight weren't married at 29 to 36 years of age. And it's a choice these days. And among those who were not married, a high percentage were not dating compared to the normal birth weight. But interestingly, 1 in 5 premature infant had never experienced sexual intercourse, compared to 2% of the controls. And once neurological impairments were excluded, differences in dating and marriage were no longer present, but differences in sexual intercourse still persisted, so that even those who were normal and without disability, there were a high proportion who did not experience sexual intercourse. Now, this is a Helsinki study, and they also reported the same. This is Finnish study, reported that 1.75-fold more likely to live in parental home, less likely to have cohabited, and males and females were more likely not to experience sexual intercourse. And both male and females had smaller number of lifetime to date sexual partners compared to term born, but I think that's a good thing. So the Norwegian study, now this is absolutely amazing. Now you have here 60,000 premature births and numbers that they've got, which is 5.2% of the population. That's the prematurity rate there. So what they wanted to look at reproduction in the premature group. Now, stillbirth rate was higher in the premature group. And again, there was a gradient. If we were 22 to 27 weeks, it was 20.8%, and then gets lower until 7.6% per thousand births among the full term. Reproduction also was lower among 22 to 27, and only 25% of females and 14% of males had reproduced, compared to 68% of females and 50% of males in the control group. Not only that, there were recurrent preterm births in females. If you were a premature female, there was a higher chance that you would have a preterm infant. And we've seen that among some of the children that I call them children by mistake. They're adults, they have premature children. So the risk is higher. If you're 22 to 27 weeks, the risk is 14%, and it gets lower, and at term it's 6%. So not only do they have lower reproduction, they have stillbirths and premature births. And several studies have reported fewer subsequent pregnancies in women after preterm birth. That is the mothers of these children, that once they've had a premature birth, they are unlikely to have too many other children or not at all. And the Finnish study with 10,000 very preterm births have shown fewer subsequent children. And it's a poignant reflection of the broad impact of prematurity. And they used an emotive term, the missing siblings. That means the premature group did not have siblings or had very few siblings. So together with infertility, stillbirth, and premature births among the prematurely born women, there's the impact on the total family dynamics, which is significant. So if we look at growth, health, and cardiometabolic sequelae, as Manoj said, we've looked at every which way on these children. So I published this in a long time ago, up to 24 years of age, and you have males and females here, and weight, height, and BMI. And you can see now in the old days, they lost a lot of weight because of our nutrition was not so good. But then they started gaining weight, and at adolescence, between 8 years and adolescence and adulthood, they gained quite rapidly. There was still a difference, but they made up for it, and similar pattern in males and females. The height as well, and in the end, the height is smaller in both males and females, but the BMI was similar. So if we look at the measurements at 36 years of age, and you can see mean difference in height was 6 centimeters, and mean difference in weight was 5.6 centimeters compared to controls. And the BMI was normal. The same, I mean. We looked at blood pressure, and we looked at blood pressure before as well, and we didn't find any differences. But here we found differences, 114 systolic compared to 109, and diastolic also was higher. So there was mean difference of 5 millimeters in diastolic, in systolic, and 3.2 millimeters in diastolic. Now you might say, oh, this is very small difference. What difference does it make? But it has been shown in many studies that a 5 millimeter increase in systolic blood pressure is associated with a 34% increase in mortality due to stroke. So even small differences contribute to major differences in the stroke. Now, this APIC collaboration, as Manoj referred to, see, we collaborated with the Finns on the study at 30 to 36 years of age, and we were funded together. And while I was sitting in Finland at the table, I said, if I can work with you, why can't I work with the rest of the world? And Eero Kahanti said, oh, well, you go ahead. So I wrote to everybody who was doing adult studies, and to my surprise, everybody agreed to participate and share data so that we can have a higher number of data and which gives more validity. And so we started in 2014. This is not funded at all. We meet twice a year at the PAS meeting and then the European Society. So here we collaborated with 9 centers, including McMaster, to get the blood pressure. And so this is published, and you can see that we now have a higher number of there's about 1,500 um, adults. And again, the difference in mean difference in blood pressure is 3.4 systolic and 2.4 diastolic, with women having greater difference. My friend Catherine Morrison and I looked at cardiometabolic health, and by DEXA, she showed that premature children have increased body fat and reduced lean mass, and a fourfold increase in developing dysglycemia. And if you had high body fat, it was the strongest predictor of dysglycemia. So here you see the premature children here, normal birth weight here, pre-diabetes is higher, type 2 diabetes is higher, but not statistically significant. But dysglycemia was very significantly different from that of normal birth weight. And had we not looked at this, we would never have known. Pulmonary function, again, other people have done that, particularly from Australia, Lex Doyle, and they've shown increased airway resistance, decreased forced expiratory volume, and lower exercise tolerance. And of course, if you have BPD, the outcome is worse. And the children had 4 times more asthma, and it was inversely related to gestational age. And smoking and air pollution adversely affected lung function, and you won't believe some premature children did smoke and wouldn't stop smoking. Now, mental health, socialization, and psychiatric disorders, these are very important issues. And we looked at mental health as well as others. And our McMaster studies have shown that there was an increase in non-substance abuse psychiatric disorders. Premature children as a whole, or premature adults as a whole, in all the studies, they are less abusing substance abuse or marijuana or even going to jail. They are less risk taking. So we found that the OR was 2.5 in these psychiatric disorders. And Scandinavian registries have confirmed the increased risk of psychiatric disorders as well as ASD and ADHD. And the Swedish studies have shown there's increased hospitalization for psychosis, depressive, and bipolar disorders, and also a lot of medications, antipsychotic, antidepressants, etc. Now, people say the personality of very low birth weight infants is different. So what is different is, and we've shown, and other people as well have shown, that premature children have higher shyness and behavioral inhibition. Their risk aversion is higher, and they adhere to societal norms, so they don't do anything that shouldn't be done compared to other individuals. Sorry. So they have lower sociability and emotional well-being, and they're lower extroversion, that is, they're less outgoing, and they don't like to try new experiences. And, these behaviors may explain some of the things that premature infants don't do, like taking risk seeking behaviors. And also, they may impact on the lower rates of employment and social difficulties in peer, partner, and romantic relationships because they don't express their emotion, they're shy, they're less outgoing, and that may be the problem. Now, we've also looked at quality of life studies at teenage and adulthood in a very systematic way, and I don't have the time to explain that today in our talk. But also, as Manoj mentioned, there was another way as well. I mean, you can look at the references. The, the quality of life studies are very interesting because even children with disabilities report having a good quality of life. But as I said, this depends on the society. In North America, they get a lot of help, and we are tuned to helping disabled and inclusiveness. It's a very important issue in North America. And this may not be in the rest of the world. So they may not have a good quality of life if they have disabilities. But when I used to see these children, I was amazed at how well they're doing. So I asked them to write stories about their lives, and they wrote such beautiful stories that I felt compelled that everybody should read them. And my colleague John Tyson was so impressed that he funded me to make this 25-minute video, which is absolutely worth seeing. It's very emotional. I tried to include children with disabilities and without disabilities. So, quoting from one of them, this young woman with autism says that uh, despite my outward appearances, and she's very petite, she says, I'm still proud to be me. I wear my differences like a badge of courage. I won the battle and war against prematurity, and if these deficits are the price to pay for being alive, then I can live with them. And this young woman says, this is the only life I know, and I'm happy. So, why do some children do well and others not? What are the factors that affect the later outcome? And Alan Job, tongue in cheek, said, how come any of the less than 1 kilos are normal? Because all the things that they go through, it's terrible. They go through so many issues in the neonatal unit. How come anybody is normal? So there's continuity and change over time. And Bowlby, who was in the 50s, wrote the attachment theory, said that if you have early life experiences that are adverse, they're permanent damage, it's irreversible. He's not talking about premature infants, he's not talking about cerebral palsy, he's talking about adverse life experiences. But Werner and Smith, who looked at children in Kauai, reported that these are again children not with disabilities, but those who were social deprivation and economic deprivation, that if they had these adverse experiences in infancy, and if the subsequent environment was good, then they could recover. And there are certain protective processes. If you have a good mentor or a teacher or a neighbor, they can change life's trajectories from risk to adaptation. So there's plasticity, resilience, and recovery. And what is plasticity? The human brain development is fortunately very slow. And so with these good experiences, you can override the adverse effects. And so there's neuroplasticity, which is the capacity of the brain to rewire, and neurogenesis, which is to create new neurons and connections, and these go throughout life. But plasticity critically depends on the environment in which the child is raised. This is Samaroff and Chandler who did very good studies. So there's an interplay between biology and environment. So environment can help change the problems that the children experience due to biology. And there's resilience. And resilience means that you don't eliminate the risk, but the end product allows you to deal with the adverse conditions effectively And so you're resilient. And people always say premature children are resilient. But resilience is not easy to come by. It's a hard thing, but they do achieve that. And sometimes they achieve it even more and they more than non-deprived individuals. You know, heard of so many individuals who were premature and contributed remarkably. What are the other factors that alter outcome? So, brain lesions, of course, have a permanent effect, and you cannot change that. But earlier biomedical risk factors play a smaller role, and as they grow older, the other factors, social factors, have a greater impact. And high SES can modify the impact of prematurity on IQ so that ELBW children from high SES had similar scores to term controls from low SES. And this was remarkable. We showed McMaster rates of high school graduation was similar to Maureen Hack. You know, Maureen Hack died a few years ago. She was a real leader in the US. And but she lived in Cleveland, and the population of inner city is quite deprived. So our graduation rates was of less than 1 kilo was similar to her normal birth weight cohort. So that's the impact of social class. And it's been shown that if you have poverty, the brain grows slower. And so the brain volume is higher in high social class and lowest in the low social class. So look at the difference. And that makes a difference, as I've shown you with the Victorian studies, that they do have an impact on the educational output. So, what about the future? So, overall, as I presented, the premature children have done extraordinarily well, and they've shown them to be doing nearly as well as the controls. And again, had longer term follow up not been done, we would never have known the extent of recovery. And I wrote this in 2007 before I did the adult outcomes now. And so I had no idea about the subsequent health complexities that I faced. You know, at 24 years, I was very happy things are going well. And subsequent health complexities, as I've shown you, are significant. And so, future of premature infants has to be looked at from a lifespan perspective because recovery can continue to take place until adulthood. So, when you discharge a child and say, okay, you know, you will have a lot of problems, and this problem and that problem, and cerebral palsy, etc. But they have to look at the total lifespan. You have to tell them that recovery occurs until adulthood and they will catch up. So longer term cohort of newer cohorts is essential because medicine has changed, neonatology has changed remarkably from the 70s and 80s to now. And also there are more social interventions, particularly in North America. So in summary, the premature children continue to be disadvantaged in job opportunities and social functioning. There's mounting evidence of cardiovascular and metabolic sequelae problems. There's increased infertility, lower rates of reproduction, and higher prematurity rates among those who are born prematurely. And the worrisome concern is the high prevalence of mental health disorders, anxiety, depression, and psychiatric disorders and hospitalizations, particularly in females. So, what are the trade offs? The survival today is more than 90% of very preterm infants to adulthood, but there's an expense associated with this, and there's a trade off. And now, because there's, and as I mentioned earlier, the more you study, the more carefully you study in depth, the more problems you're going to find. And if we didn't look at cardiometabolic sequelae, we wouldn't know. If we didn't look at reproduction, remarkably from the Norwegian studies, with very large numbers, we wouldn't have known that premature children are less likely to reproduce. So again, we've too fine tooth combed, and that's why we find so many things. And we did a very large executive summary here. If you look at that, It's very detailed. And there's also a full summary in pediatrics. So even a modest increase of 10 to 20% in chronic conditions can translate to substantial public health expense as well as individual and societal burdens. And I haven't shown you, but there's also evidence of premature aging. You know, um, their, their appearance is older and their brain maturation is such that it's older. And the Scandinavian studies have shown premature adult mortality as well, although they have not, they're still young, so they have to follow through to get the exact figures. So, what are the implications for current survivors? Well, the current survivors have so much better technology, better nutrition, gentle care, pain management. And despite remarkable survival of more and more immature infants, the morbidity hasn't increased. You know, we would have expected, saving 22 to 23 infants, that the morbidity would have increased, but it hasn't. And the functional impairments in most of the children is milder than the children from my era. And since the 1990s, the rate of cerebral palsy has declined in the Western world. So the long-term outcome, I hope, is likely to be better or not too different. But unfortunately, some disabilities will persist. And I know in India, Santosh Bhargav has also worked on adult outcomes of premature infants with Barker, who subsequently died. But again, that's interesting, and they're also showing cardiometabolic sequelae. So, final take home message is that extremely preterm infants show amazing resilience, as the word being used, and despite disabilities, many are functioning well. And we should be, as health professionals, circumspect in not too far early prognostication. There are people who tell children who are being discharged who've had some brain injury, oh, they'll never walk and talk again. It's not to be done. You have to help families look at the positive side. So, to reiterate, the negative effects of extreme prematurity are observed in a small subgroup and are not uniformly deleterious. Some with disabilities are mild and some are severe, but it's not uniformly deleterious. Most former premature adults seem to enjoy a healthy and fulfilling life. And again, I'm talking about North America and Europe. And this message must not be lost. I usually say that in my presentations, but Neil Marlowe put it in one of his papers. So thank you for your attention. And I have to acknowledge the immense gratitude of the premature normal birth rate who followed me for 4 decades. And we are still working now on children in the adults in their 40s. And that'll take a few years to be published. And this work would not have been possible without my collaborators, mentors, research staff, and the funding agencies. And this young woman who's now got a new baby, she says, how do you say thank you for life? And here I end. Thank you very much for your attention. So,
Yeah, that was amazing, madam. Dr. Manoj?
Please
can I
take over. Please take over, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was really awesome and amazing, Professor Dr. Saroj Saigal ji. In fact, that long-term outcome, very few people can do such a long cohort. You have done, followed up these babies for such a long time. And it's really...
I want to tell you, I didn't plan on doing this. It just happened that at every age, I would say, I wonder what they're doing at adolescence. I wonder what they're doing at adulthood. I never planned ever that I would do all this long-term follow-up. So it's just circumstances.
Yeah, it's really, really amazing because the curiosity you had to follow up those babies, that is really appreciable. And we have very few studies showing this, and you have highlighted, especially what what was very striking was you had mentioned about those, the impact on the sexuality, the growth, the reproductivity, and of course the mental health issues. But what about other issues, ma'am? Did you had an opportunity to see about the ROP and the vision or the hearing?
Oh, yes.
Um,
We have reported the health in great detail in many studies. And we accidentally discovered that some of the children who were premature had a retinal detachment all out of the blue when they were adults. One young woman was in Paris and suddenly she went blind and the retina had detached, and this was not reported before. And this we discovered accidentally because I said, have you had any surgeries? And so we have
mm,
published on their general health, and they do require more medication, the more hospitalizations, and um, in every aspect, the asthma, the BPD, and psychiatric problems. So the number of medications they use is also higher. So we've reported the general health. As I said, we've reported every function that we could think of. Exercise tolerance, and, their activities, we've reported on that, which is lower as well.
yeah, actually, I'm a professor of neonatology at Nilofer Hospital, which is in Hyderabad in India. No, it has I think the largest, I should say, I don't know if any other center has around 300 newborns at any time on bed. So we have a huge incident. I mean, the numbers of premature babies now, as you rightly said, all over we are seeing a lot of survival of small babies. And the long-term follow-ups were definitely we have not done such a long follow-up yet, but I'm sure we'll have our own stories to say. Especially, I'm really worried about this ROPs and incidence of ROPs and hearing defects, along with, of course, the other things which you have already mentioned. Dr. Nandini, you would like to take up? I think there are
Uh,
questions also in the
yeah,
question answer
there
box.
are questions which are there. I think we will move on to the questions. I think it was
Yeah.
quite an exhaustive talk, quite overwhelming to hear the outcomes of these babies in adulthood. Starting with the first question, Dr. Hariram from Bangalore has asked, uh, with the current practice of aggressive nutritional strategies, gentler, kinder approach, reduction in IVH and NEC, we can expect better outcome in the long run. What is your opinion?
Well, that's what I'm hoping. We are saving smaller and smaller infants now. In my cohort, I had some 24 weekers, but now they're 23 weekers and some 22 weekers as well. So even despite that, the disability rate has not increased. One would expect it to be increased. We are all worried, why isn't it decreasing? But then we're including smaller and smaller babies. So we should be thankful that it's not increasing. And yes, so I'm hoping that, and God knows what technology we'll have in 10, 15 years for the current survivors. So it should be much better. I'm very optimistic.
Yeah, there's one more question by Dr. Laila. It's very obvious that social status and early follow-up and early intervention matters, but which is not always available. So how can we advise parents? Can we have, as caregivers, a standard intervention to support unsupported families?
Yeah, that is a big problem, particularly in India, and also the educational status, because there's still many people who have very little education. And so, interventions are very expensive, extremely expensive. And people have shown that when you do intervention, there was one study from Harvard where they did incredible intervention. They bussed the children to a center and they gave them better nutrition and taught all day in school. And they showed differences in the IQ. But the intervention was stopped at age 3, and then there was no difference later. So intervention has to continue. What parents have to know is they can help the parents. You can give them some written instructions on how to stimulate the children, how to talk to them, how to do for motor assessment, tummy time when they're infants. We give handouts to these in children, the parents, for the new. I still do follow up until 3 years of age for all the preemies and those with high risk. So we give them some written instructions, and there are, of course, in Canada and other places, intervention programs where they will go to the house, and during the COVID, it was still by Zoom. They
Yeah.
were still getting some attention. I've been seeing patients mainly by Zoom. So you can help by talking to them, encouraging them. It's very important. You don't discharge patients and say your child had grade 4 hemorrhage. So, as I said, people say he'll never talk or walk. You give some encouragement. And we've seen times, so many times, when they have very significant impairment, MRI or ultrasound, and they don't do as badly as we expect.
Mm.
And so there's hope, and hope has always to be given to the parents.
Yeah, as we
Without
have seen
hope,
in your presentation, the brain is very still very plastic and resilient. So there is a scope for healing. So I think we
yes,
need to be positive. Centers, they're there in all districts. So maybe this can be of help in India. Over to you, Nalini.
Yeah. Here's a question. How did premature SGA babies compare with the premature AGA babies? Was there a difference in the adult outcomes?
yeah. As you can see, we had a small sample size of 168. And so we did have a higher rate of stillbirths than, small for gestational age relative to the population. So we had in this about 24 children who were SGA, but that's a very small sample to then say what are the differences. But if you look at the larger studies, the SGA are a little more disadvantaged than the AGA in terms of their education and other parameters. So we still don't know we need larger samples again to see, do they have higher cardiometabolic sequelae, which we would expect. Because again, it's this deprivation and then plenty theory of Barker that, if you give them more, help them to get back to normal birth weight, normal growth parameters, that they're likely to have higher risk. But we haven't been able with our small sample to explain that. And there are not that many studies on cardiometabolic sequelae in a large sample. See, the Scandinavian studies give you a lot of data, but they do not do health and measurements of health and sequelae.
I think this is a question related, modifiable factors. What are the modifiable factors in the NICU with regards to cardiometabolic morbidity in young adult life?
Yeah, so, this is all very new, and we are giving better nutrition, but we're also cognizant of the fact that, and there are some studies that suggest that we are overfeeding or giving too many calories. But it's so hard to do these studies, it really, and because once you discharge them, they're out of your hands and you don't know what's happening. And so when you do studies, like even breastfeeding studies, you don't know what proportion of them were breastfeeding and how much was supplemented with formula. So we're promoting breastfeeding to prevent future cardiometabolic sequelae. And supposedly that's one intervention that I'm sure in India, women are breastfeeding. And women here weren't breastfeeding, and now they're all breastfeeding. So
that's great.
That's great. Yeah.
And guidelines on DNR in different nations.
Yeah, that's a very emotive and difficult question to answer. And should we be saving all these infants? I mean, one has to think of the future in countries that are low economic status. How much should you spend on saving these children and increasing the burden in the families, if they have disabilities? Individuals with disabilities in India are even more deprived because of the social conditions. and not the help. Here, the government will give help, and healthcare to everyone is free. So it makes a huge difference.
Yes, Nandini.
Dr. Rajat has asked, what stands out as modifiable factors in the NICU with respect to cardiometabolic morbidity in young adult life?
Well, that's
She
what
has
I
said
just
that
addressed.
breastfeeding.
Yeah. And subsequent growth and follow up.
Yeah.
We should make these big. Sometimes it's amazing how
Mhm.
mothers force feed and they're so big and they shouldn't be. So we dissuade that. Follow their growth percentiles.
Yeah. Dr. K. Divakar has asked, you had mentioned about early adult mortality. Will it be possible for you to get information for relation between intervention to manage PDA and adult survival?
Intervention in what?
Intervention to manage PDA, patent ductus arteriosus, and adult survival.
Oh no. Uh, it's so hard to take one individual piece out of the total. I mean, it's not
Yeah.
just the PDA that's making a difference. There's so many other things, the lung function, the brain function. You just can't take one item at a time. And that gives you misrepresentation.
Right.
All you can
Also,
say is that if they have PDA, there may be more risks. All I can say.
yes. Is precocious puberty more common among children born preterm?
Yes, some studies have shown that there's precocious puberty in these children. But again, how you measure puberty is a very different thing. And, for males, you have to be a little more invasive and measure the testicular size and everything. And so it's a lot of inhibition by people to do these studies because, you don't want to invade too much privacy. But on the whole, premature children are having early puberty. The girls are having their periods at a much younger age, the menstruation at a younger age. And it's difficult in males. So it's still ongoing. I can just say that there's a tendency.
So I think there was one question on do you have any data suggesting role of complementary and alternative medicines helping with the ongoing care of preterms, post-discharge, and their outcomes?
No, I'm afraid I fail in this area.
So Dr. Ravi also wanted, can you something more, a little more details about the kind of psychiatric disorders you noticed in your study?
Oh, yeah. The psychiatric disorders initially were behavioral problems and anxiety problems. And what we find, a lot of women have anxiety problems, and depression is also showing up. We haven't had any schizophrenia, but in some studies it has been reported very small incidents. But mainly it's anxiety and depression that these individuals face. And that impacts if you're depressed, you don't avail of getting jobs and things. So that has an impact. And it has a huge impact on quality of life. And I can tell you that mental illness sometimes is more debilitating than physical illness.
Absolutely.
Cerebral palsy, you can function much better, but with mental illness, it's very sad. So that mental illness, these have been increasing steadily. In very minimal in teenage, at young adult, we saw it starting increasing, and right now it's increasing quite a bit. And some of our patients have, nobody's committed suicide, but some of them are really depressed, and I try and stay away from the actual patients, seeing them, because I don't want any biases. So we have researchers who do these studies, but they do phone and say that they are.
I think we need to look at confounding factors, other reasons for depression also, and then how do we relate to prematurity? I think this requires a good study protocol. Then, yeah, does the outcome of preterm vary depending on the cause of premature birth? Dr. Manjusha, her
I
out.
can't answer that.
Actually, Dr. Manjusha is part of our team. She is
Oh,
copying the questions from the YouTube and posting it here. So she has
okay.
written the person who's asking there. So that because the YouTube also this is being streamed live, there are viewer watchers there as well.
Yeah, yeah, lovely. So, does
Yeah,
the
it's
outcome of
so
preterm
difficult.
vary?
You know, only, the only people who can answer these questions are the Scandinavian studies, but they don't have all this data. You know, the cause of prematurity, you know, they don't have this data. And you also have to look at genetic factors as well. Now, yesterday I saw a child with ASD, but she had a sibling with ASD, and the former wife had two children with ASD. So look at this high family dynamics, you know. So it may not be just the prematurity. This child is destined both by genetics and prematurity. So it's, you know, to look at minutia, it's not possible.
Anthony, any more
I think there
question?
was one question earlier.
Anand?
Are there established guidelines for health maintenance for preterm babies to have the highest long-term growth and developmental outcome? Dr. Jagjeet Teji has asked.
I didn't
I think
follow the
some of that
question.
had been covered. Yeah, some of
That
that I
was
think had been
covered.
covered
Yeah, I
already.
think
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
I think one question, did you look at outcome of extreme preterm babies less than 25, 24 weeks? Did you look at this population?
the 24, 25 weeks.
Yeah, less than, yes.
Yeah, well, in my study, we had fewer. So, but in the other European studies, Scandinavian cohort studies, the linkage studies, there's definite gradient, you know, gradient in everything, their education, their disabilities, their ability to complete high school, ability to generate income, it's all related. So 23 to 24 weeks and then 25 to 26 weeks. So with the Scandinavian studies, you can, it's so easy to look at this age and compare to that age group, gestational age group, I mean. And also you can look over time. You can look at the 1980s or with the 1990s and see if there was any difference. But as I said, they had fewer babies who were very premature because they didn't save them. Europe took a longer time to save premature babies. So yeah, it's, you can speculate that it's gradient and everything will be poorer.
I think these studies are so important because we all, whether it is India or abroad, we are having our facilities are upgraded. Many of the pediatricians and neonatologists are trained and trying to save babies. So, and a huge number of preterm babies are now out of their NICUs, and they require a good follow up to see how their lifestyle is, what are the outcomes, how they are doing. That's really sometimes perplexing. We are somehow taking care in the NICU, but what's happening to them? Madam, Professor SAROJ SAIGAL, you really done, I mean, your studies, what you've done long term is really amazing, and we require more number of studies like this to see whether what we are doing in the NICU is enough or not. The follow-up program is very important.
The follow-up program, I think, is really important. This
Very
is where
important.
we educate the parents, you know, for feeding issues, for intervention
There are
issues.
so many issues.
Yeah, and then early diagnosis of cerebral palsy and helping them to refer to centers, treatment centers, so that physiotherapy is given. So you kind of improve. You can't eliminate cerebral palsy, but you can improve the outcome.
Yeah. Speech therapy, then we have physiotherapy, then detection of problem, behavioral issues, and helping them out at every stage. That is very, I think, a huge work to do for all of us. Over to you, Nandini. How much you want to? Any questions?
Yeah, I just would like to mention that in India, probably the long-term follow-up, we do lose quite a lot to
Yes.
follow up because of the expenditure involved. Because in other countries, that might not be much of a factor, but then in India, we do lose quite a bit to follow up. and hence we may not have the actual numbers. But yes, it would be great if we could do a study like this up to adulthood, which I'm sure nobody can replicate Dr. Saigal's study, especially in India probably. And yeah, I think we are thankful to have listened to your wonderful talk. And I'm just seeing if there are any other questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Professor Saigal, actually, I just wanted to share, I already mentioned, I'm from a government sector. I'm from a teaching institute from a government sector. So would like to I just mention that RBSK program is running in India, and it is has to reach out to many other districts in the peripheries. But it is something is there, a platform has been created to follow up all these babies who have defects, delays, and disabilities. So it's all computerized, it's all in the software, and it is possible for us now to have a long-term follow-up of these babies. I think we can also do something like Dr. Professor Saroj. Maybe after 10, 15 years, we'll have data, and the data in India will be definitely huge. So we can also share our stories from India. Thank you so much. I think we are end of the questions. Nandini would like to say something. Then we hand over to Dr. Manoj.
I think we would hand over to Dr. Manoj. Thank you so much, Dr. Professor Saigal. It was wonderful to hear your exhaustive presentation. And it was our privilege, our honor to hear from the illustrious legend, Dr. Saigal. Dr. Manoj, you could take over.
Yeah, I think I would like to salute Professor Saroj Saigal, being a teacher and researcher myself. It's so difficult to do such long-term cohort studies. Hats off to you for such amazing work, and we are all motivated to do such works as interacting with you. Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity, Dr. Manoj. Over to you.
Virtual platform has a lot of advantages, but this is one occasion where I feel sorry that it's not a physical conference, so that we could all give a standing ovation to one of the greatest legends of all times in neonatology. And I am not exaggerating, madam. No, it is like you just say that getting a Virginia Apgar award is just nothing, but it's something we all look up to. All the awards that you have, the decoration that you carry, it is not the decoration alone. The kind of work that you have done is unique. I am really amazed at the kind of the substance that today's talk has brought into our minds. Thank you so much. Now, before I hand over to Dr. Vishnu for the official vote of thanks, I would like to thank all the respected delegates from 71 countries who are attending live in Zoom and YouTube, and then going to watch in the next 24 hours in the various time zones. Today we have been covering preterm care in the last few lectures. We had Professor Alan Job talking about the antenatal steroids, and the next one is going to be on a core neonatology, intensive care, by one of the legends who has done a lot of work in stem cell care, in perinatology, ventilation, and all, Professor Boris Kramer on ventilation strategies in extreme preterm neonates. But before I go, I would again like to thank personally Professor Saroj Saigal and invite her personally, God willing, for the grand final of the Learn from the Legend series, tentatively scheduled in first week of March. That is the IAP NeoCon 2022. Hopefully, madam, we would have you either physically or at least virtually for the conference. Thank you so much, madam. Over to...
And I really enjoyed this very much, and I'm so